Hi, everybody. This is quite a turnout. We're both like really surprised.
Thank you, everybody. This is incredible. I think this is the largest crowd I've spoken to. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks to all of you. Well, I'm so excited to talk to Fiona about The Stolen Queen, which is her 8th historical fiction novel. And if you guys are not familiar with her work, all of her books are actually set in a historic New York City building. So this one takes place at the Met, and you also take us to Egypt. So we're going to unravel all of that, but I kind of wanted to start by asking you, what sparked this idea?
For the Met?
For the Met and for Egypt, for it all.
Yeah, so the idea came, people had talked to me all the time about, oh, you should do a book at the Met. And I thought, yeah, but it's enormous. You know, how? It has 18 or 19 different departments. How do I figure out a way in? And then one day I was reading the New York Times, and there was an article about the 2018 Met Gala. And it was an incredible gala, and Kim Kardashian went. And I never thought that I'd be talking about Kim Kardashian in my historical fiction author talk. But she went, and she wore this very tight, gold spangly dress. And at some point in the evening, she stood next to this sarcophagus that the Met had just bought the year before for $4 million. And it was gold and spangly. And so you had Kim next to this sarcophagus. The photo was incredible. It went viral to the point that the guy who'd smuggled and stolen the sarcophagus complained to an undercover cop that he hadn't gotten paid. Now, this got back to the Manhattan DA's office that has a whole unit on stolen art. And they did some investigating, and they found that the sarcophagus had been stolen and the papers had been falsified. And the Met was forced to return it.
Wow.
And I thought, what a fantastic mix of ancient art and pop culture all embodied in one building. And that's when I thought, okay, that's my way in. We'll do the Costume Institute and the Met Gala, and we'll do the Egyptian wing.
And why in particular the Egyptian wing? The moment you realized that, how did your research begin?
I was pretty daunted, and one of the first things I do is I talk to a man named Andrew Alpern, and he is an architectural historian in New York City. He's in his 80s, and he has a photographic memory of every street and every building. And so the first thing I do is I take Andrew out to lunch, and I say, okay, what do I not know about this building? And he lets me know. And then it was a matter of talking to everybody I could. So talking to curators, to technicians, to handlers, security guards, just anybody who worked at the Met I could get my hands on. And it was just a wonderful deep dive into a beautiful, beautiful building.
So you and I share something in common. We both are journalists by training. You graduated from the Columbia School of Journalism. I would say our end work products are very different. I write thousands of words less than you do. But as writers, we're obviously always looking for a story. You had this idea, you started to do your research, getting to know the building, but I'm curious, did the character come first to you? Did you have an idea of who you wanted to place in this setting, or did you kind of allow the research as you were going through and learning about people and history, or the Met Gala itself? Did you let that inspire you to develop these characters?
Yeah, I start out kind of a blank slate, and as I do the research, I'm looking for the surprises. Because I know if something surprises me, it will surprise the reader. And so with this book, it was thinking about, okay, who's the character I want to focus on? And I knew that I wanted the character to be 60 years old, because I'm 58, and I felt like we're kind of underrepresented as the heroine. Yeah, right? And so I thought, okay, what if we have an associate curator at the Met, and she does all the work and gets none of the glory? She's been there for years. And that's where Charlotte came to be. And so it was figuring out who Charlotte was. And then I knew I didn't want it to be a love story. I wanted it to be about friends, female friendship, mothers, daughters, that kind of thing. And so I thought, okay, who is Charlotte's complete opposite? Mm-hmm. And that's where Annie came to be. And Annie's 19 years old. She's an unqualified, completely out of her orbit in terms of being the assistant to the Met Gala, the woman who's running it, which at that time was Deanna Vreeland. And so Annie is 19 years old. She has no idea what she's doing. Charlotte is 60 years old. She knows exactly what she's doing. And these two unlikely heroines are paired up to try and track down a stolen object.
So tell me a little bit about, you have some characters who were real people in this book. You have others who are inspired by these very heroic heroine characters. Tell me a little bit about that. When do you decide, okay, I want to include this person, but I want to make this person more into a character?
Yeah, it's a tricky dance, because what I do is I do all that research and then I use that as a kind of scaffolding and then layer a fictional story and fictional characters over it, because then I can make things up.
Yeah.
Which you don't do in journalism.
Yes.
And the freedom of making up dialogue, oh, I love it. But it's tricky because I want to do a mystery. I love a story with a mystery. So you're turning the pages, you want to find out what happened. And so because of that, sometimes I'll read about a character and think, oh, she's wonderful, but she'll be the inspiration for a character. But in this book, you had Diana Vreeland, and she ran the Met Gala in the 1970s, and she was an incredible whirlwind, tornado of a woman. She was born in Paris, and her mother used to tell her when she was a young girl that she was ugly. And she grew up and she became the head of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. She was this fashion icon. And she's known for she was quirky. She would wear rouge that went to her earlobes. She had black lacquered hair and very pale skin, and a really wild sense of style, very outrageous. And she's best known for her sayings like, "Pink is the navy blue of India. The best thing about London is Paris." And this was in the book, "Unshined shoes are the end of civilization." And she was just such a, you couldn't make her up. And I knew she just had to be in the book. I couldn't make a fake Diana Vreeland. And so I read a lot about her. I watched the documentaries. And I found whenever I did a scene with her, it's like she piped in from above and was like, here, say that, do that. She was very strong-willed in my head.
Yeah.
And so that was fun to bring her to life.
And what about Hathakare, who is the Egyptian queen, a fictional character, but she's based on a real Egyptian queen. Tell us about that and when you decided to make her into a fictional character.
Yeah, so she's based on Hatshepsut, which is hard to say. And I changed it to Hathakare because it was easier to say, but the narrator of the book still was like, come on, come on. So Hatshepsut was fascinating. She was born into royalty. She married her half-brother at the age of 12, as one did. I don't know if you know the author Kate Quinn. She's wonderful. We were doing an event together, and she said, yes, the Egyptian family tree is very narrow.
There you go.
And he died about 7 years later, and she didn't have a son. So the crown, the pharaohdom, went to the infant son of a concubine. And so while that child was too young to rule, Hatshepsut stepped in, and she became a wonderful leader. There was trade, there was prosperity, there was economic, everybody was doing well. There was architectural and artistic advances. It was incredible. And then she died, and the stepson took over. And at some point, he had many of her statues destroyed and her reliefs hacked away. And because of that, she was really lost to history. They knew she ruled, but they weren't sure how important she was. And it wasn't until the Met was doing a dig in 1920, and they uncovered this quarry filled with pieces of statue and put it together and realized, oh no, she was very important. But what had happened? And they said, well, it must have been that he was very angry that she usurped his power. And so after she died, he had everything destroyed. And it was that until the 1950s that the Met catalog described Hatshepsut as a vain, unscrupulous, and ambitious woman and a detested stepmother. And then, 10 years later, a scholar found that the destruction had to have happened 24 years after her death, which is a really long time to hold a grudge, right? And they were thinking, oh, well, what's that then? And they said, well, maybe it happened near the end of her stepson's reign when he was worried about passing it on to his son. And there may have been females in other clans who also had a right to the throne, and he wanted to get the idea of a female pharaoh out of the public eye, which explains why they were hacked. And I just thought, this woman has gone through so much, and they recently found her mummy, which I describe in the book, which was fascinating in itself. And And so I went to see the mummy when I went to Egypt. And it's in a museum, and you go into this room, and it's dark, and you have to talk quietly. And I remember walking around it and thinking, oh my gosh, that's her. That's the woman who ruled Egypt 3,500 years ago, right? That's the queen. That's her hair. Those are her nails. And it was just so shocking, this kind of idea of past and present colliding. And I wanted to bring that into the book in some way. And so in the book, Charlotte's trajectory is all similar to Hatshepsut's. And in the book, Hathakare is Charlotte's obsession. She's found out some new information about her. She's very excited. And her trajectory was that she was revered, and then erased, and then reviled, and then restored. And I just love that sense of, okay, let's bring these women who are lost back to light.
Yeah, that was a prevalent part of this book, just how their fates were intertwined, thousands of years apart. Tell me a little bit about why you found it so important for a past heroine and a present day heroine to kind of help each other, in some ways, grow, have their stories be completed.
Yeah, I think because so many women, even in Charlotte's age, because Charlotte, in part of the book, takes place when she's a young woman in 1930s Egypt on her first dig, very excited, but getting very kind of pushed to the side by all the men who are on the dig with her. And I think so many of women's history has been lost because men write it. And so it's kind of nice to revive it and to bring it back to light, and also to see how things happen in cycles. That in ancient Egypt, women could get divorced. If they divorced, they could keep their children. They could own property. And then you jump to the 1970s, which is when Charlotte's around, and a woman couldn't get a credit card without a man co-signing for it until 1975. And so you kind of see how we move forward, we move back, and there's something kind of reassuring to me in that.
At what point did you decide it would be interesting to have a younger character, a younger woman, Annie? You mentioned she's 19 years old, very eager, just wants to find her place in the world. Why did you decide that trio of women? Obviously, it's a duo between Charlotte and Annie, but in some ways it does become a trio. When did you decide to include her into the story?
Pretty early on. Poor Annie, she's a parentified child. So her mother is a former model. She's very demanding, very emotionally needy, and Annie takes care of her, basically. And she really needs to pull away and become her own woman, but she doesn't know how. And so she's looking for models. So she looks at Deanna Vreeland, show me how, and then Charlotte. And she just wants to find out how to be a woman in the world. And so I love that idea of this older, experienced woman paired with Annie. And I described the book best, I realized this when I was on book tour. It's Indiana Jones meets Thelma and Louise meets The Devil Wears Prada.
Yeah,
That's
can
the book.
confirm. They also have like this mother-daughter relationship. It's in some ways, as you mentioned, like the vacancy that they don't have in their life. It's also this mentorship relationship. How did that evolve as you were writing?
Yeah, whenever I'm writing a book, I figure out, okay, what's the heart of it? Like, what's inside me that really wants to explore this subject, or what is it? And, I'd written love stories and men and women before, and I just wanted to explore. My dad died a couple years ago. And so my mother and I were very close, but you get closer under those circumstances. And I thought, I'd love to really work into that mother-daughter dynamic. What is it like? And so in many ways, Charlotte and Annie are mother-daughter in many ways, but also Charlotte in the book has a tragedy, which I won't give away. And so that's at the top of her mind as well. And so, yeah, that's where that came from. I just knew that was going to be the kernel of the story for me.
Yeah. I won't give away too much of what happens, but there's several scenes actually based in Egypt. I think one of the scenes that you portrayed so vividly was, I won't say which characters, but they're walking around in the market, going in and out of stores, and your own research took you to Egypt. Tell me a little bit about that. Why did you even find it important to go there? Is it the fact that you just wanted to bring those scenes to life in a different way than just kind of imagining what it could be like?
Yeah, all my books so far have been set in New York City buildings, and I love the fact that the first one that I go away, I don't go to New Jersey, right? I go to Egypt. I'm going to knock it out of the ballpark. And so then I realized, well, if I'm going to set it in Egypt, I should probably go because I can write it off, right?
Smart. Get your miles in.
Right? And I knew I wanted, you know, if I'm describing a character going into a tomb, I need to know what that feels like. And so to go to the Valley of the Kings and walk through these entrances that are very narrow and you know, they're very claustrophobic, and you walk down this long tunnel and it opens up to this room that's painted just gloriously and still intact. And what the air is like. You know, is it cool? What does it feel? And, you know, things like in the afternoon, the sand would start blowing and the sun would turn orange in this kind of otherworldly feel to it. And I knew I had to go there if I wanted to try and describe that and to bring that into the book. You know, you want to make it as visceral as possible. So, I don't want to describe the desert for 3 pages. No one wants to read that. And so finding things out like, okay, in the 1930s when they were out there in the desert, they would sleep in cots under tents. And before you would go to bed at night, you would put cups of water under the legs of each cot so the scorpions couldn't climb up.
Oh, wow.
And the minute I read that, I was like, yes, right? Because that's going to ground the reader right in the scene.
Absolutely. And does that work?
Apparently.
Maybe.
They made it. Yeah, they made it
go.
out. There's a wonderful book called Empress of the Nile by a woman named Lynn Olson. It's a nonfiction book about a woman, an incredible woman who was, among many other things, an archaeologist in the 30s. And that was really helpful for me in terms of getting the time period right.
And Charlotte was also based on an archaeologist, correct?
Yes, so that's Christiane de Roche Noblecourt, who is the character in Lynn's book. And she was a French woman. During World War II, she helped save the Louvre from being looted by the Germans. And then she went to Egypt, had some incredible finds, and was part of bringing the Temple of Dendur to New York City because she wanted to save those temples when they were going to flood the Nile with the Aswan Dam. And so there was just so much she did throughout her entire life. She's a powerful, wonderful woman and a great role model.
You mentioned earlier, and this kind of was a theme in your book, I will be honest, sometimes when I go to a museum and I'm staring at all these wonders, I don't automatically think, you know, how did this get here? You really bring in kind of the ethics of stolen art, whether, you know, this is something that was legally obtained, or as it is the case, and as you mentioned, you were inspired in the 2018 Met Gala because of that sarcophagus that was, you know, not properly processed and taken away and all of that. I mean, why was that so important to you to make sure that that stayed in the story? It very much was a through line throughout the book.
The ethics of stolen and looted art are just so much in the forefront today. I felt like I had to address it. Otherwise, it would be kind of smoothing over things that are a little rocky right now. And so it is a real question, like the Benin bronzes, which were stolen from what's now modern Nigeria, where the British went and had this bloody and violent occupation. They looted so much from there. There's photographs of these soldiers standing next to piles of things that they took back. And they're all over the world. They're in the British Museum, they're everywhere. And so every museum is grappling with, what do we do? Because if they want them back, what happens if they don't have a museum to put them in, right? Will they be safe from humidity or from theft? Or what if the country needs money and so they sell them to an oligarch who puts it in his yacht, you know? What happens when researchers and scholars and students can't get access to this art? And so it's a really tough question that curators around the world are grappling with, and I thought it was an important one to raise. I mean, there was one story I read that a man had bought a lot of stolen art because he didn't know. But then his fabulous apartment was photographed for a big architectural magazine. And the police were like, oh, yep.
It's like, we've been looking for those.
Took it back.
Thanks for letting us know it's in your living room.
If only it were that easy.
Right, you would think. So I'm sure many people here have read this book, but there might be some of you who have yet to uncover it. When you were going through this, it was a very long research process, right? It took about a year or so?
Yeah.
When you were going through that process, what did you hope the takeaway was?
Yeah, you know, the more I looked into it, the more I think I wanted to show these women who've done incredible things and kind of reclaim women's lost contributions to history. But on top of that, I wanted the reader, if they go to a beautiful museum like the Met, again, it can be so daunting. But if you look at the objects, not as a series of objects, but a series of stories, right? And behind each object, there's some incredible story. And then it becomes a collection of stories, which I think is much more easily to digest. And it really shows so much of how the times and the places and the people of the past have changed.
So I'm curious to know, what is next for you?
Yeah, so the next book I'm working on now, and most people know my books, like Grand Central Terminal, or, you know, they know the buildings, the New York Public Library. And this one, not many people know, even people in New York City. It's the oldest house in New York City, and it looks like it belongs in Virginia. It's got these columns, it's white, it's set in these beautiful gardens, but it's up on 160th Street, which is a little further north than a lot of people go. And it's called the Morris Jumel Mansion. And it's a gem of a museum. You know, the Met, they don't need me to write about them, they're doing fine. In fact, the Met Gala from this past year, just to show how things have changed over time, the Met Gala in 1949, it was kind of a fundraiser in a hotel. It cost $50. The one this year cost $75,000. That's how much a ticket was. It raised over $30 million for the collection, the costume collection there.
Oh my goodness.
The Costume Institute, yeah. So it's quite something. So then you have the Morris Jumel Mansion. If you looked at it right now, it's got scaffolding on one of its columns. It's really beautiful, but it could use some love. And its history is fantastic. It was the headquarters for George Washington during the Revolutionary War for a month. And then later, it was owned by this woman named Eliza Jumel. She was born the daughter of a prostitute in Rhode Island. She came to New York and she became the richest woman in Manhattan because she was so good at real estate. And she's incredible. Her second husband was Aaron Burr, who we know from Hamilton. But she divorced him very quickly because he was taking her money. And she used as her divorce attorney Alexander Hamilton Jr.
Wow.
So this is a woman with a sense of humor. And a lot of brains. And so it's been really fun. And like I say, it's a gem of a museum. They could use some love. I'd love to send people uptown to go and support it. And I thought this would be a fun way to do that.
Yeah, so again, a theme of a very interesting woman. And also this building that I have never heard of it. What came first in this process?
It's always the building. Okay. And so I find the building, and again, I'm looking for the surprises. Like, for example, the New York Public Library. I was doing research on that, and I found that when they built it, they included a 7-room apartment deep inside for the superintendent and his family to live in. And they lived in the library for 30 years. His daughter was born in the library. The kids used to raise pigeons on the roof. They used to play baseball using books as bases until they got caught. Okay. I mean, and I thought, okay, a family in a library, that's a book. And then for the Magnolia Palace, that was an interesting one because there the inspiration came from looking at the doorway of the Frick collection, which is a beautiful, recently renovated museum in New York, the home of Henry Clay Frick. And above the door is this woman carved in stone. And I learned that her name was Audrey Munson. And she was the supermodel of the 1910s, right? She posed for every sculpture in Manhattan. You can find her everywhere. She rises above the fountain in front of the Plaza Hotel. There's 3 of her at Columbus Circle. She's everywhere. And what happened was she was very successful, and then her landlord killed his wife very violently. And the police, as they were investigating, found a black and white photo of Audrey in a bathing suit. And they said, well, it must be a love triangle. And so they started hounding her. Wow. And so she and her mother fled upstate New York, but things just didn't go well. She tried to die by suicide by drinking mercury. And then finally her mother put her in an asylum where she died, get this, in 1994 at the age of 104. Wow. And at that time she was buried in an unmarked grave. And I just thought, here's this woman who has been lost to history, right? We know the sculptors' names, but we don't know her name. And look at everything she did and went through. And so there's a character in that book called Lillian who's inspired by Audrey Munson. And what was so wild about that is a few months after the book came out, I got an email through my author website. And a woman said, my mother and I were reading your book, and we recognized her because my mother took care of her at the asylum in the last few years of her life. And that she was this beautiful woman with very sad eyes.
Oh, goodness.
And so it's just wonderful to bring these women to life in a way. And in the afterward, in the author's note, I always make very clear what I've made up and what is fact, and other resources so you can learn all about the rabbit holes that I went down.
Yeah. And obviously all of your books, as we've discussed, are based in New York. Why is that such an inspiration to you? Have you ever even thought like, well, should I go to Chicago? Should I go to LA? Should I go abroad like you did in this book?
Yeah, you know, New York I've been there since I graduated college. It's my home. And I love that research, so I need to go repeatedly. I mean, I was at Grand Central nonstop. I stalk the places that I'm working on. And so that helps to be near home. But I'd love to go to London. There's some wonderful buildings. In fact, someone was just telling me today, or was it yesterday, at the mansion on O Street?
Yeah.
That has secret doors and secret rooms. I'm like, oh, I'm there.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Oh my gosh, yeah, write about it.
I mean, that's
really
a great
cool.
title. We're set. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
There's a lot of history, I think. If I could be wrong, please check this. But like one of the founding fathers wrote some sort of document in there as well. Like there's a lot there besides just the hidden doors.
I like this. Yeah, yeah. So that's the kind of thing that just gets me so excited.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear, you know, how you're kind of thinking about, obviously you're in the middle of this process for the next book. You mentioned just this extensive research process. That's kind of a journalistic trait. I don't necessarily spend years on a subject, but you do. Can you tell us a little bit more about, you know, you've talked about the idea and the development of the characters, but when you find yourself stalking, which I jokingly sometimes will say, I know exactly what door a lawmaker's coming from, and that sounds really stalkerish, but it's just gotta.
It's your job.
You gotta know what to do, where to be.
Yeah.
You describe yourself as that. Tell me a little bit of, you know, when do you know, okay, I've collected everything I need to know on the building or to bring this character to life? When are you putting the pen down?
Yeah, you know, it's usually, I've done, you know, I've just stuffed my head with information, which I'm sure what you do when you have a new subject. You're, you know, who do I talk to? What documentary should I watch? What book should I read? You know, what YouTube videos will help me? Everything I can to understand the building, the people, and the decades that I want to talk about. And at a certain point, I just hit a tipping point, and I don't know if you do too, where you're like, okay, the first line comes to me, or something about the character that just, oh yeah, okay, I think I've got it now. And at that point, I do character worksheets and figure out who the main characters are. What do they want? What are their goals? What are their vulnerabilities? And then once I have that, some people sit down and they just kind of wing it. I could never do that. I'm the daughter of engineers. And so I very carefully figure out each timeline, because usually there's two. So I figure out each timeline, what has to happen, and then I spend a couple weeks braiding them together. And those 2 weeks are when I'm usually drinking a lot of wine at night. Because it is so hard to keep a mystery going and not give away something in one timeline that screws up the other, and you're rearranging things and figuring it out. But once I have that, I have a roadmap. Okay. And then I follow that. I usually write the older timeline first, then the newer one, braid them together, and then I have a rough draft and something to go with. And then it takes around 10 rounds of edits to get it into shape.
I'm sure by the end you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to read this again.
Oh yeah.
I reach that point too sometimes.
Yeah, after you've gone through proofreading and copy editing and you've just read it and read it and read it. But then what's interesting about the publishing industry, and this is different than yours, is that it goes to salespeople and to, you know, they have to get the cover and print it out and do everything. So that's about 6 months after I've turned in the very last draft. And by then I'm working on a new book, and so when I'm ready for book tour, it's like visiting old friends. And it's like, oh, there's Annie, there's Charlotte, there they are. And that's really delightful.
Yeah, it's refreshing, again, in some ways.
Yes.
You mentioned, you know, these two timelines, and that's also another unique character of your books. At some point, you know, you say you're weaving in these timelines. Does that also make it apparent to you, the characters, whether it stays as someone who, a real person, or you're like, wait, the dates aren't adding up. So maybe I'll take this person and make them into a fictional character.
Yeah, and in fact, I realized I didn't answer your question about Hatshepsut and Hathakari. I tend to get sidelined.
We have time.
And so with Hatshepsut, I used her name at first, early in the drafts, and then I realized that I'm taking my character Charlotte, and she's doing all this work that other archaeologists and scholars have done, right? And so I'm really taking away their contributions, and I didn't want to do that, and so that's when I changed her name about halfway through those drafts. And then in the author's note explained, here's what really happened. Here's who the real people who did the work are. And Charlotte is, kind of a stand-in for them, if you will.
Right. And we've obviously talked about how women are such an important part of not just this book, but other books as well. There are male characters in this book, just FYI. But they each bring their own personality, character, and they do play supporting roles. Tell me a little bit about, how those characters developed for this book.
Yeah, with each of them, Charlotte has a love interest early on in the book. And yeah, her boss is this major curator who is interesting, but, hard to work for, would you say?
Yeah.
And so there's a security guard who's a love interest for Annie. And just adding to the population of the museum, of the people who work behind the scenes and trying to give them their due, that was very important. And so bringing in the characters that way, but it is very much a female-driven story, for sure.
Yeah, and early on in our conversation, you mentioned how you really saw yourself in Charlotte. Is that something that happens when you're writing different periods of your life that you want to include, or whether it's in the moment, like in this one? Tell me a little bit about that. How much of your own characters are inspired by your own stories?
Yeah, I think there's a kernel of it, but then they take off.
Yeah,
they really do. And I keep on my bulletin board, I have photos. I think of the celebrity who I think would be good in the movie. And I put their photo up because it helps me see them as a three-dimensional person. So it may start off with the kernel of something that I'm gnawing on. But then for this book, for example, Charlotte Rampling, the actress, that's Charlotte. And then Merritt Wever is a wonderful actress. She's a little too old now, but she'd be a great Annie. And so those are the ones that I kind of pull on. So they really do turn out and become their own people after a while.
Okay, that is so interesting and so fun.
Now
I want to know all of the characters of all your books and who you matched up. You're like, okay, yes, in a movie.
Like Emily Blunt's one. Yeah, It's so much fun. Yeah, Emily Blunt's the lead of The Lions of Fifth Avenue. Yeah, it's so much fun. It just helps bring them alive because I'm thinking, okay, she has, say dark hair and blue eyes. It's just whatever. But when it's Emily Blunt, you're like, yes.
Yeah, you can really, really write out the particulars. Even I'm assuming how they move and
yeah. What are their tics? What are their tells?
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I have been curious. Why historical fiction for you? Why is that something that you decided? Okay, this is my lane. I want to stay here.
I kind of fell into it. I've always loved reading it. And I was working as a journalist, and I was looking at an apartment at the Barbizon Hotel for Women, which is now a condo. And I learned I didn't take the apartment, but I learned at that time that when it went condo, there were a dozen of the old-time residents still living there. And they'd been there when it was, who was there? Grace Kelly and Joan Didion, and they were still there. And I thought, okay, they moved them into these fourth-floor apartments. They're studio apartments that they pay about $200 a month for. And then they built these luxury apartments all around them. And I thought, okay, what's it like when one of those women gets into the elevator with the guy who bought the $17 million penthouse, right? Who comes out alive? And I just thought, what a great story. And you could tell it in two time periods where maybe there's a journalist in modern times investigating the disappearance of one of the older my mind just started worrying, and what if there was a tragedy in the 1950s? And I thought, I really want to read this book. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try writing it. And that eventually became my first book, The Dollhouse.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about that, because I'm sure there's many people here who write their own stories or are thinking about maybe putting pen to paper or writing it out on a laptop, on a computer. Tell me a little bit of how that process was like for you. When did you jump from journalism to let's be more creative in our writing?
It was very slow because I told myself I'm going to try and write a book, and I won't tell a soul.
Yeah.
Because then it won't matter. And so I started writing it, and I was taking classes and trying to learn the craft of writing fiction, which is so different from nonfiction. And if I'd known how hard it is to write 2 timelines and an element of mystery, I would have never done it. It was crazy.
Yeah.
It was impossible. And so it was quite a slog getting through that and figuring out because I didn't know what I didn't know. But I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to see how it turned out. And just, it was a challenge just to see if I could do it. And I got through that, and then I thought, okay, now what? And so I started going to writers' conferences to learn how the industry works, because it's so different from journalism.
Yeah.
And I would go to writers' conference, and I remember hearing a woman, an agent, talk about how she was looking for strong female characters. And I thought, okay, I'll send it there. And she eventually, I sent the manuscript to her, and she called me. And she said, I really like this, I want to represent you. And I didn't have a title at that point, because I didn't know you were supposed to make one up. It was called the Barbizon Project. And she wrote back and she said, I have a very good title for you, but I'm not going to tell you unless you let me represent you.
Oh, interesting.
And I said, sure. And it was the Dollhouse, and she's been with me ever since, and it's been just incredible and such a fun ride. We started out kind of slow. The Dollhouse came out, and people bought it, and a nice little bubble of interest. And with each book, it's just grown and grown and grown. And I've I think I've hit every library in Long Island by this point. But it was just finding a readership and finding a match for the books where if you love New York, it's a good read. If you love historical fiction, it's a fun read. And each book, you'll understand where I'm coming from, but it's a completely different time period, different characters, and a different kind of mystery.
You mentioned going to all of these different bookshops. How important is that for someone who is, in the process of maybe releasing their book or, wants to talk about it? Build a following. It's a different kind of following than social media, all of the new technology nowadays. But that's so important, right? To meet people and kind of say, hey, this is me, this is my book. Tell me a little bit about that, especially in terms of advice for people who are kind of looking for that.
Indie bookstores are the key, the one that supports here, Politics and Prose is incredible. And all around New York, there's all these wonderful indie bookstores in every town. And so I would just go around and hand over the ARC, and it had gotten a really nice review in Publishers Weekly, an early review. And so I'd say, oh, this was, this got a nice review, and I wrote it. It's crazy.
Just put yourself out there.
But I walked into one store in New Canaan, Elm Street Books, and the woman said, who was behind the counter, said, oh, I looked at the Barbizon, I'll read that. And I was like, yes. So slowly it kind of picked up. And then to my 5th book, I got a call after it came out from my editor, and she said, you've hit the New York Times list. I was like, oh.
Yeah.
And that was wonderful. And so but it's nice to get that slow build, because you get to know the people and behind the scenes and the other authors of historical fiction who are incredible and so supportive and such a great, great crew. And so, it feels like it's just been a wonderful ride. I started writing when I was 45, and I published at 49. And I always say, it's never too late. I couldn't have written a book in my 20s because I hadn't lived enough, right? I hadn't been divorced. I hadn't, loved. I hadn't had loss. And I wrote the book when I was ready to, and I felt like I had something to say. And so, you can do that in your 60s, 70s, 80s. It's never too late.
Right. What other advice, if someone, again, eager to just start this process, maybe they haven't lived as long, had all of these experiences yet, they're nervous about that, what do you tell them?
Oh, to just go for it, and to finish the first draft, though, because it's too easy to start a book and think, well, I have a better idea, I'll go to that. But it's not until you've written a book from beginning to end that you get a sense of what you can do and how you tie up the loose ends and how do you bring closure to the characters. And once you've done a book, you have something to edit. And so you have something to sculpt and play with. And that, to me, is the key, is to get from A to Z and give yourself the gift of that really bad first draft. It's terrible. It's okay.
Yeah. Would you say that first book that you wrote, was that maybe the heaviest lift, the one where you learned the most, or were there others along the way that it struck you, something surprised you about the process?
Yeah, with each book, I've kind of learned something different. Each book, something's changed along the way. As you go along, it just becomes, things start bubbling up, and you go, oh yeah, you did that last time, and you shouldn't do it again. Fix that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were there any moments when you were writing some of the other books, or maybe even in this one, that you had that kind of spark that, wait, I've toyed with this already, I've kind of explained this, or I've kind of experimented with this storyline?
Yeah, with each one, it's been, how are we on time, by the way? Are we,
Okay.
do we have time for Q&A? Okay, I just want to make sure we're,
Yeah.
Okay, good. Tell me your question again. Sorry, I got
Oh, yeah, and I think this is actually a good segue. If you all have questions, you can see that there's microphones down these two aisles. If you want to start getting up, getting in line, that way we can get through as many questions as possible from you all. What I was asking you was just, was there a moment in which you were writing one of your books where you realized, okay, I did write about this before, or
Yeah, in fact, I'll use a name and
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, no, you can't use that name. That was in the address and yeah.
Yeah.
So I often, I'll come to the same names or same themes, and I just want to make each one different. And so The Stolen Queen was different because it was different perspectives, different timelines,
Right.
and a little more of a complex structure to the book. And I like that, of challenging myself and trying to, keep things fresh and keep things new.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Let's turn it over to you guys who have questions. We'll start over here on the left and then.
All right. Usually in a book that's published, it says, any relation to real people, living or dead, blah, blah, blah. And then the legal department makes you put that in there, right? So when you use the real name of a real person, like Deanna Vreeland, does legal give you a trouble?
As long as they're dead, you can write about them.
It's a fun fact.
Everybody I use is real, they're dead. So Henry Clay Frick and his wife and daughter Helen Frick are real people who lived at the Frick Mansion in the Magnolia Palace. But because they're long gone, I could create them as a real family. And the thing about writing about them is that one of their descendants published a number of biographies about the family, and they were so dysfunctional that I couldn't include half the stuff in the book, right? So yeah, as long as you're clear, as long as they're dead.
How about you?
Yes.
Hi.
You're good.
So, historical fiction is my favorite genre. I read it all the time. It's my dream to one day publish a historical fiction book. I'm kind of working on something right now, but I find that whenever I work up the courage to sit down and try to write a few lines or a few pages, I feel just daunted in terms of the scope of the time period I want to write about. Because there's specifically what I want to write about. There's so many dates, there's so many locations, that I haven't necessarily visited. And you've spoken about your research process and kind of how you establish your timelines and what you want to write. But I'm wondering if you ever still experience kind of those jitters when you finally sit down to write something, and kind of how you personally overcome that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think every day is different. Some days it just flows easily, some days it's tough. And I think it's okay to give your permission to have a bad writing day sometimes. Sometimes it's just not working, but just get those words down. I usually do, between 500 to 1,500 words a day if I can. And maybe they're all bad, but I'll go back and I'll change that. And in terms of kind of rooting it in the history, I would try and do a lot of research first and let that guide you as to where the story will go, as opposed to doing the story and researching at the same time, because that can be tough as well. But I wish you the best of luck. I think that's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Hi, thanks for this awesome conversation. David Brooks published an editorial in the New York Times about how fiction's falling apart and it doesn't have any value in society anymore. And I've been thinking about that ever since, that we know that most fiction is read by women, and the genre of historical fiction, like this young woman, it's also my favorite genre. Probably most of us here, many, many women want to read the stories of women who were forgotten in history. And I was just wondering, how do you put that sort of, you know, what value does it have from your perspective for all of us? I think it has great value. I've learned so much. And so I want to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really interesting question. I think the thing is, history cycles. And when you read historical fiction or when you write it, you recognize these cycles that, you know, in the 1910s in Greenwich Village, people could hold hands if they were of the same sex and a couple. You know, there was much more freedom than we think it was. We think history is linear and that, you know, things get better. Well, they don't. Sometimes things get better, sometimes they get worse. And just recognizing that and that we've been through this before and we will get through it. But also recognizing, okay, things could get really bad too. So what do we have to do to stop that? What can we learn from the past? And, you know, for me, I just would love to time travel, right? If I could, I would love to go back and wear a corset and, you know, go back to the Gilded Age, not the series, the real one, and, you know, bring antibiotics, so you're fine. But I would just love to do that. And I think that's so much fun, is to just go back in time and imagine what it was like, and to be able to share that with readers and compare stories and is just, it's a joy. I love doing it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I was really interested to hear how you talked about like the process of deciding you wanted to write a book and then taking classes and everything to learn how to do it. And I was curious, in taking writing classes or reading craft books, is there a particular book or lesson learned that really shaped your writing?
Yeah, you know, I started taking classes at Gotham Writers Workshop, which is it's online as well, and just taking a short story class and learning how to write and hearing your work through other people's eyes, and also editing other people's work was very helpful. And then Stephen King has a book on writing, incredible, Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. There's a number of very good craft books out there that are helpful. And, you know, they're homework, but they help you kind of see what you're doing, what mistakes you're making, and hopefully just keep your writing, keeping it clean and easy to read and, you know, fun. There's a lot out there, and I definitely recommend checking them out. Even as you write and as you've written 3 or 4 books, it's so much fun to go back and revisit a really good craft book and remind yourself what you're doing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. My question is, as your writing is so grounded in historical fact, and especially considering uplifting stories of, you know, women who have been forgotten and things like that, where do you decide in your creative process, like how much to stay faithful to the history and like the time period you're talking about and like these iconic buildings, and when do you sort of insert your own creativity? How do you find that dividing line between historical and fiction?
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a really tough one to follow, because you don't want to have an anachronism in there that just is jarring, right, and pulls the reader right out of the story. And that's the help of a good editor, for sure. But what I'll do is often I'll read books in that period that were written in that time period, and that helps to keep it grounded and make it feel like it's of the right era. But yeah, I think that's really the way to do it. It's a tricky balance, and you just don't want, you want the heroine to be, you know, spunky and get things done and feel, you know, push boundaries, but you can't have a heroine who is, you know, from the 1960s and throw her in the, you know, 1890s. It's 2 different types of drive that those women have, and their obstacles against them are very different. And so I think that would be the main thing to explore, is what are the obstacles in their way, and how do you keep that grounded in the right time? Sure.
Hi, thanks for being here. It's been wonderful to hear from you. I'm a big fan of your work. I've read a lot of your books, and I'm curious if you have a favorite character you've written, or maybe the one you find the most interesting.
Ooh, it's always the one you're working on. You know, that's your love. But yeah, writing about Laura in The Lions of Fifth Avenue was really interesting, and also the character of Sarah in The Address, which is set at the Dakota. She was fun to write because she's a woman coming from England to be the first housekeeper of the Dakota. And so that was really fun to see a building being built on the Upper West Side, when at that point it was described as goats, shanties, and rocks. And then they built the Dakota. And you can just imagine what that would have been like rising, out of the ground. And so she was fun too, because it's just a way to kind of get inside and get behind the scenes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, so I'm working on a historical fiction project, and it's set in the 9th century, and so I'm constantly having to look things up and be like, oh, did they have buckets back then? Did they have?
Yeah.
My question is, how do you know when you've done enough of that when you've done enough research, basically?
There's a wonderful author named M.J. Rose who passed away a couple of years ago, and she was writing a book set in Roman times. And she was trying to figure out what the shoes were made out of or what color they were, something very, very specific. And she was asking around, she couldn't figure it out. And finally her editor said, it's just shoes, just, you don't have to worry about that. And she realized, oh, right, I was being that's the thing is you can get right in the weeds if you're not careful. And then suddenly the story comes to a screeching halt because you don't know what the shoes are made of. But you have to do your best. There's so many great resources, and you can find them online. And of course, the Library of Congress is a great resource for that kind of thing as well. And yeah, do what you can. And also, what I would do is write that first draft and just get through it. And things you need to look up again, just mark with an asterisk or something so you can easily search for it. And then go back and make it specific once you've gotten that draft down, just so it doesn't stop you. Because if you don't, you will just keep on, hitting the brake. And you want to get that writing flowing and get those characters moving. That's the important thing. I love the bucket thing, though. Did they have buckets?
They had stave-built buckets, yes.
This is good. I like this. You know what you're doing.
Hi, thank you for coming in your talk. You talked a lot about how much research you do, and you obviously gathered so much material for the books. How do you balance that with how much, not putting too much information and that getting in the way of the plot or the character development? And also just a fun question, is there anything fun that you learned about Egypt or the Met Gala that you didn't get a chance to include in the book?
Yeah, okay, so the second question, I remember, and I don't know if this is in the book or not, but I learned there's 1.6 million objects at the Met, but only 6% are on display at any one time, right? All the rest are in storage, which is incredible. That's a great question. And then what was the first one?
I was just asking, how do you balance with not putting too much information, just
It's tough because you've done all that work and you want to share it. I know what buckets were made of, or I know what shoes were. And I remember writing the book about the Fricks and describing the room that they were in far too much because I was just showing off. And you do that in the first draft, that's fine, go for it. And then, for the second draft, I realized, okay, this room, I don't need to describe the cornice. But what might be better if it's a dinner party, what if I describe what they're eating? And so I went to the Frick archivist, and she sent me menus of a 1916 dinner party. And who were invited, what were the dishes, turtle soup, there's some kind of Marmite thing that was very strange. And putting that in, because just reading that is what grounds you and grounds the reader and makes it feel like these characters are where they should be.
Last question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was really interested by your answer about why New York City. There's the very practical consideration that you live near it. And then I was very interested when you said another city you would like to do is London. Because growing up, I read all these books set in New York City and London, and then I studied abroad in London, and I lived in New York City for a bit. And sometimes I'll have to go years where I put a moratorium on reading any books set in either city. And I have complicated relationships with those cities, but you can't deny that there is some sort of storytelling drive to both cities. So I was interested in if you have any reflections like that about New York City or where it might stem from. That it just feels like stories start in New York City, or they just feel like they start in London, and other places don't have that feel as much.
Yeah, my parents are both English, and so we would go back to England every few years to visit relatives when I was growing up. And we'd drive around in a rental car, and we'd drive all the way from Portsmouth up to Scotland and back down. And at some point, my brother and I would start beating each other up in the back seat. And so they'd stop every so often at a castle or a ruin or a grand estate, and they'd let us run wild. And I loved that. I loved how old everything was, that there are these layers of history, that there's these buildings with, you know, ghosts who've haunted them for years. And what was it like for a servant girl in the, you know, 1500s to walk down this hall? What was it like for an aristocrat in the 1800s? And so I think there's something like that. And New York has that too, where there's just layers of change in history. And I realized that whenever you come to New York, your first year there, it's like it's preserved in amber, right? That is the best New York has ever been. From there, it's just, oh, I remember when that was a, you know, and so it slowly changes, but every generation does that. And so every generation has its amber moments, and then the moments when, oh, you know, all these glass buildings, it's terrible. And so I think that's why those two cities, because they're just layered, you know, they were built on something and then something else was built on that, and the layers go on, and they're fun to explore and to compare.
I know I said last question, but now you have the last question for sure.
Sorry.
No, you're good, please.
So when I was reading the opening scene of the archaeological excavation, I got teleported back to when I was 19 and going on my first archaeological dig.
Wow.
And I was just wondering, you said you went to like the Tomb of the Kings and stuff like that. Did you get a chance to go to an active dig site or participate in anything like that? Because you seem to capture what it's like to be on excavations so well.
Oh, thank you so
good
much.
job.
I'm so impressed that you've done that. No, I didn't get a chance to go on a dig myself because the time didn't work out. We were able to see the pyramids and sail up the Nile and the Valley of the Kings and that. But you know, I was able to, through books and through YouTube and that, because I needed to figure out not how an excavation is now, but what was it like in the 30s. And so that to me would have been valuable. I would go to that because it was different instruments, it was different people involved. I had to know what was the hierarchy of the dig at that time. Who was up here? Who was down here? What were the dynamics between the Egyptians and the British or the Americans who were doing the dig? And so it changed a little bit in that way. But I'm so glad to hear that the basics were solid. Thank you. I appreciate that. Woo.
You did a good job. Approved.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a good conversation.
It was great. Thank you for
Thank
coming.
you, everyone.